Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study. Today we're going to continue in the book of Ezekiel. We're going to study chapters 45 and 46 today, which means we're getting dangerously close to the end. There's 48 chapters, so we'll be through in a couple of weeks after today. So we're in 45 and 46. We're going to be talking about 45. We're going to talk about the division of the land for the priests and for the Levites, the Zadok priests, the Levites, and the prince. It's an interesting chapter, sort of. I mean, it's different. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We'll start with let's go to verses 1 and 2. Let me read those for you. When you allot the land as an inheritance, you are to present to the Lord a portion of the land as a sacred district, 25,000 cubits long and 20,000 cubits wide. The entire area will be holy. A certain section, 500 cubits square, is to be for the sanctuary, with 50 cubits around it for open land. 25,000 cubits by 20,000 cubits. This chapter 45 is full of measurements. I want to do this one conversion, and then we're not going to talk about conversions before, because we need to understand that these cubits are just a measure. It's a measure they used back in those days, and it kind of doesn't mean anything to us because we don't know what a cubit is. It's 21 inches, actually something about 21 inches. But if we convert 25,000 cubits to feet, you would take 25,000 multiplied by 21 cubits and divide by 12. And you end up with 43,250 cubits. If you divide that by 5,280 feet per mile, you find out that 25,000 cubits is about 8.28 miles. That's quite a long distance. The 20,000 cubits would convert to 6.5 miles roughly. So you get an area here that's 52 square miles. This is a big area. 25,000 cubic sounds big, but really until you put pen to paper and get your calculator out, you don't really know how big it is. So we're talking about an area about 52 square miles. It is presented as an allotment of land to the Lord. It will be a sacred district, and the entire area will be holy. Now, if just for the sake of information for you, if you're doing personal study and you want to go through here and you want to really know how much 500 cubits is, or you want to know what 1,000 cubits is, depending on one that you run across here, you really want to know what size you're talking about. What you would do is take that cubit measure and multiply by a factor of 21 divided by 12. So you would multiply by 21, divide by 12, and you would convert cubits to feet. All right, so that's just for your information. You'll know that going forward. I'm not going to say anything more about it, and I'm not going to do any more conversions, because we just need to know that it's a conversion. It is important because God is specifying how big these certain areas are supposed to be, and he means that to the cubit. All right, to the fraction of a cubit. These are the exact measurements that he's wanting for these areas that we're going to be talking about. But beyond that, I'm not sure there's a significance to them. There might be one that comes up later along the way, but not for today. Okay, so it's an area that is for the Lord. Verse 2 says it's for a sanctuary, uh, and it's a 500 cubit by 500 cubit square, and it's a pretty big sanctuary. And there's an open area 50 cubits wide all the way around it. So that makes it even bigger. All right. Yeah, in chapter 40, verse 2, that was the start of the area here where we're talking about the temple and these holy measurements. But it says in chapter 40, verse 2, in a vision of God, he took me to the land of Israel and set me on a very high mountain on whose south side were some buildings that looked like a city. All right, this is what he saw. He got up on a big high mountain, and it better be pretty high if he's going to see all this at one time, because he sees an area 52 square miles in size. I don't know how big Dallas County is, uh, but it's we're talking about a large area. It looked like a city from a distance in his vision, 52 square miles. Okay, so uh, it takes us to verse 3. Chapter 45, verse 3, it says this: in the sacred district, measure off a section 25,000 long by cubits long by 10,000 cubits wide. It will be the sanctuary. It will be the most holy place. Verse 4 says, let me read verse 4. It will be the sacred portion of the land for the priests who minister in the sanctuary and who draw near to minister before the Lord. It will be a place for their houses as well as a holy place for the sanctuary. All right, so this is the area that is set aside for the Zadok priests, the Levite priests that are descendant of Zadok. These were the ones that were obedient to God back in the day, back whenever this was talking about. But it was the probably in the neighborhood of the Babylonian exile and the Assyrian captivity. But the Zadoks were holy and obedient, but the rest of the Levite priests went far from the Lord, and they were involved in the apostasy and that sort of thing. So they are going to be punished, we see as we go through this. But the Zadoks get this special area allotted to them. And it says it's for their houses as well as a holy place for the sanctuary. Now, it's for their housing, and it will be a holy place. It's for their towns. Let me say right now that these verses are enigmatic. And I used to see the word enigmatic in commentaries. I thought it was a big, intimidating word. And I finally got around to looking it up. What does it mean? It means hard to understand. Enigmatic means hard to understand. So these verses have always been, there are many scriptures in the Bible that are enigmatic. They're hard to understand. This is more of it. These are enigmatic verses because, for one thing, we're not used to having they use terms like sanctuary, like holy place, like priests living on campus, so to speak. There's an area here they're saying for their priests. That's enigmatic, and it's enigmatic because we're not used to those words and those jobs. We don't have our pastors living on campus, so to speak. But we're also not Jewish. The Jews would have read this, they would have heard this, and it would have made all the sense in the world, because what it is, it's a translation of what they had before the temple was torn down and destroyed. It is a conversion into a future temple and they're being told what that future temple is going to look like. So for them, it wouldn't be that difficult to understand. For us, it's a little difficult. Okay, let's look at verse 5. What I would say, though, before I move on, that what we should do in all cases of Scripture, if we don't understand what it is, what we do is make our best effort to understand what it's talking about, what it's saying, and then what we hope for is for understanding and revelation to understanding in the future. You'll understand better things later than you do right now, for example. So, but what we do our best job to understand what we're reading, and then we move on. All right, so let's go to verse 5. Verse 5 says, an area 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide will belong to the Levites who serve in the temple as their possession for town and as their possession for towns to live in. All right, these are the Levite priests that were talked about in chapter 44, verse 11 and 14. They were the ones who were far from the Lord. So they're still going to have a job, but it's going to be a lesser job than what they would have had had they not been disobedient. And we go to verse 46. You're to give the city as its property an area 5,000 cubits wide and 25,000 cubits long, adjoining the sacred portion that will belong to all of Israel. So the whole house of Israel gets this, and it's for the city. And I can only assume that would be Jerusalem. I don't really know. But verse 7 says that this is for the prince. Let me read. Verse 7 says this, the prince will have the land bordering each side of the area formed by the sacred district and the property of the city. It will extend westward from the west side and eastward from the east side, running lengthwise from the western to the eastern border, parallel to one of the tribal portions. All right. So this is a section that is will be given to the prince. All right, verse 8 says, this land, this is where it gets kind of interesting. This land will be for his possession in Israel. So that is the area that is going to be given to the prince. Then it goes on in verse 8 and says, let me see if I want to read more. Yeah, it goes on in verse 8 and says, and my princes will no longer oppress my people, but will allow the people of Israel to possess the land according to their tribes. Now, what that is for is for the Jews. The Jews will fully understand this. We have to go back and read history books to understand it. But there was a time when the princes of Israel were very corrupt and dishonest, and they took the land from the people through various means. They found ways to take it, and God is saying now through Ezekiel, those days are over. That's not going to happen again. All right, so we go to verse 9. Verse 9 says, this is what the sovereign Lord says, you have gone far enough, princes of Israel. Give up your violence and oppression and do what is just and right. Stop dispossessing my people, declares the sovereign Lord. So he says those days are over. All that corrupt business where there was actually violence and bloodshed apparently during those times. And land was taken, dishonest measures were used against the people, and God is saying that's over. And he's going to say more of that right now, starting in verse 9. Let me read verse 9 through, let's see, this section is a rebuke of the priests for their dishonesty in the use of scales, weights, and measures used to weigh offerings brought to the temple. All right, now this is kind of interesting because this is what Jesus was upset about when he drove the money changers out of the temple, there were people in there that were using dishonest measures in their changing of money. They had to change from the monetary, the money that was used in daily life had to be changed to temple coins, and they were using dishonest scales to make that conversion for the people and to use money to buy animals to be sacrificed. So that's what was going on in Jesus' day, and this is what he's saying is not going to happen anymore at some point. Now listen to this as I read verse 9 through 12. This is what the sovereign Lord says. You have gone far enough, princes of Israel. Give up your violence and oppression and do what is just and right. Stop dispossessing my people, declares the sovereign Lord. You are to use accurate scales, an accurate ephah, and an accurate bath. The ephah and the bath are to be the same size, the bath containing a tenth of a homer, and the ephah a tenth of the homer. The homer is to be the standard measure for both. The shekel is to consist of 20 gerahs, 20 shekels plus 25 shekels plus 15 shekels equals 1 mina. So that's what we're talking about. All of that depended on the scale. And so if the scale was used thinking that they were going to do this conversion, if the scale was lighter or heavier than what it was supposed to be, then you would get an inaccurate exchange of money. And we're saying here, God is saying that those days are going to be over. So that goes through verse 12. Now what's interesting is that what this verse infers is that sin will be present in the Millennial Kingdom. We knew that already, that sin will be there. Even though Jesus will be living there, he's going to still be encountering sin, and those are days when Satan is going to be locked up. If you recall, he's going to be locked up for 1,000 years, but sin is not going to be dead. And this kind of says that God expects adherence to his set standards. He's setting standards. He said you need to adhere to them, and that's what this is about. Okay, how about an offering for the prince? It goes to verse 13 through 17. Let me read verse 13. First part of verse 13. First part of verse 13 says, "This is a special gift you are to offer, a sixth of an ephah from each homer of wheat, and a sixth of the ephah from each homer of barley." All right, this is a special offering. It's not related to the tithe. It's over and above the tithe, and it's given by every person, regardless of rich or poor. It's not based on income. It's a specified amount. This is the same type of over and above offering that was used in the tent of meeting for the tabernacle. All right, verse 14. Let's see. Let me read on through 17. The prescribed portion of olive oil. That's verse 14. The prescribed portion of olive oil measured by the bath is a tenth of a bath from each core, which consists of 10 baths of 1 homer, for 10 baths that are equivalent to a homer. All right, you see what I'm talking about. These are things that we don't understand. They're units of measure that meant everything to the Jews. There would be nothing foreign there. In verse 15, 16, and 17, also 1 sheep is to be taken from every flock of 200 from the well-watered pastures of Israel. These will be used for the grain offerings, burnt offerings, and fellowship offerings to make atonement for the people, declares the sovereign Lord. All the people of the land will be required to give this special offering to the prince of Israel. All right, so that's what we're talking about. There is a special offering going to be given to the prince. Verse 17 and some of the verses following, I believe, for what he's supposed to do with that offering. He can't just use it to take a nice vacation. He's supposed to use it for a specified purpose. Verse 17 says, it will be the duty of the prince to provide the burnt offerings, grain offerings, and drink offerings at the festivals, the new moons, and the Sabbaths. At all the appointed festivals of Israel, he will provide the sin offerings, grain offerings, burnt offerings, and fellowship offerings to make atonement for the Israelites. So he has a special, it's like a shopping list. He's supposed to go get this stuff and provide these offerings for the people. Okay. That brings us to verse 18. Let me read verse 18 through 20. This is what the sovereign Lord says. In the first month of the first day, you are to take a young bull without defect and purify the sanctuary. The priest is to take some of the blood of the sin offering. Now, this was the offering that the priest provided for the people. The priest sacrifices it and takes some of the blood of the sin offering and puts it on the doorpost of the temple. On the four corners of the upper ledge of the altar and on the gate post of the inner court. Verse 20 says, you are to do the same on the seventh day of the month for anyone who sins unintentionally or without or through ignorance. So you are to make atonement for the temple. Okay, we've talked about that before. Unintentional sin and sin that is committed out of ignorance to the law is no excuse. It has to be atoned for. And that's what this is for. So you do it on the first of the day of the month, and then you do it again on the seventh day of the month. Verse 21 is for Passover. Let's read verse 21. Verse 12. Let's see what verse 21 says. Verse 21 says, in the first month, on the 14th day, so we had the first day, the seventh day, now we're talking about the 14th day, you were to observe the Passover, the festival lasting 7 days, during which you shall eat bread made without yeast. That means unleavened bread. Okay, it's a reminder. On the 14th day of the month, this will be done, and it is a reminder of the Exodus. It's for Passover, and Passover has always been a reminder of when the angel of death passed over and what happened, taking the life of the firstborn, where they did not put blood, lamb's blood, on their doorpost. But this was done up there as a reminder, where the priest put the blood on the doorpost of the temple. And now he says they're supposed to eat unleavened bread, and that unleavened bread was what they ate the next day after the Passover, where the angel of death passed over, because they didn't have time to let the bread rise. They had to eat unleavened bread before they were getting out of Dodge, before they left Egypt. Okay, then verse 22 says, on that day, the prince is to provide a bull as a sin offering for himself and for all the people of the land. So again, there's a specification on what the prince is supposed to do with that offering that they gave him. And he's still fulfilling that through this verse 22. So 20. Let me read 22 again, and I want to read through 24. On that day, the prince is to provide a bull as a sin offering for himself and for all the people of the land. Every day during the 7 days of the festival, he is to provide 7 bulls and 7 rams without defect as a burnt offering to the Lord, and a male goat for a sin offering. In verse 24, he is to provide a grain offering, an ephah for each bull and an ephah for each ram, along with a hin of olive oil for each ephah. All right, these are measures of weight and volume and money and all of that the Jews were totally familiar with. This is the way they did their business, lived their daily lives. And this is just talking about how they're going to be using it. Now, what's maybe you may find of interest, I know the Jews would find this of interest. This was a comparable ceremony for purification of the temple in the days associated with the Day of Atonement, for specified in Leviticus 16. Here there is no Day of Atonement mentioned, but Ezekiel does show interest for atonement for sin, given the prominent place given to the sin offerings in chapter 45, verse 25, which we're going to look at now. So there's no Day of Atonement. You know, all of these things we've talked about before are to be done as reminders of sin and redemption, provided the way they went through it in their daily lives. But here's a change. There's no Day of Atonement. In verse 25 says this: during the 7 days of the festival, which begins in the 7th month on the 15th day, he is to make the same provision for sin offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings, and oil. So even though there is no Day of Atonement, there is still practices for sin offering that should be observed. All right, that takes us through chapter 45. So let's look at chapter 46. 46 is something that's a little easier to relate to, I believe. It's going to be about regulations for the Sabbath day. We already know we don't live under the law, so the Sabbath was on Saturday, and as Christians we've come to practice our holy day, our day of worship, on Sunday. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we get into it. But these are regulations for the Sabbath. Let's read verses 1 and 2 of chapter 46. This is what the sovereign Lord says: the gate of the inner court facing east is to remain shut on the six working days, but on the Sabbath day and on the day of the new moon it is to be opened. The prince is to enter from the outside through the portico of the gateway and stand by the gate post. The priests are to sacrifice his burnt offering and his fellowship offerings. He is to bow down and worship at the threshold of the gateway and then go out, but the gate will not be shut until evening. All right, that's verse 1 and 2. The inner east gate is closed for 6 days, then opened on the Sabbath. That would be the 7th day, and the new moon, which is a special Sabbath observance, celebration, and the beginning of the month. All right, this is the fulfillment of the Mosaic covenant as a foreshadowing of Jesus, the Messiah, who is our Sabbath rest. The Sabbath was initiated under the Mosaic Law, but it actually came into being as a holy day at creation, as the 7th day, a day of rest. Let me read Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3 as a reminder of what that said back then. Genesis 2 verses 1, 2, and 3. The heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. So 6 days of creation have gone by, and now we're entering into the 7th day. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work he created work of creating that he had done. Okay. Genesis 2, 1 through 3. This is a day created by God, which he declared to be holy. If you recall, what I said in my book was this was a day, a holy day created not for him, not for God. This was a day created for man to worship God. It's a day that is set aside, which is different than all the others. And it was set aside with the purpose of worshiping God, for God to be recognized for who he is and what he's done. It's a day that's different than all others. There's no work which is to be done because God, now this is under the law. I want you to keep that in mind. We're still talking law here. It was a day different than all the others. No work was to be done because God rested. We are to rest. He didn't rest like we rest. We rest because we're tired. We get tired. God never gets tired. But he rested means he stopped his work of creation. He had completed it and he rested. And we are to rest from our labors. The Mosaic Law given by God declared that no work was to be done. It was a day of worship. And if as an example of worshiping, we see in chapter 46, verse 2, that the prince worshipped at the threshold, okay, on this day. Okay, it is the seventh day of the week, Saturday. That is the legal Sabbath day. We don't worship on the Sabbath day as Christians. We worship on Sunday, the first day of the week. We don't call it the Sabbath day. The Israelites were required under the Mosaic Law to rest, not work. It is on the Sabbath. Not work on the Sabbath. If you were Jewish and your job required you to work on the Sabbath, the Pharisees would tell you, or any other priest would tell you, get another job. That's how important it is to observe the law. God specified the law, and he didn't give an exception because you have a job that requires you to work on the Sabbath. You can choose another day. In those days, you wouldn't be working on Sabbath because nobody would have a business that was open on those days. It was a holy day, and it was legally required to be observed as a day special and different than all of the others. They would say, get another job. But we use that, but we are not under law as Christians. As Christians, we live under grace. We don't have the legal constraints and burden of living under the law. But I will say this, if you have a job and you're required to work on Sunday, you need to find another day and set that day apart that is different than all of the others. And it's a day that's set apart for you to devote yourself to God in worship. But worship can only be done. When I say worship, I don't mean just go find a place to go sit in church on Sunday. Worship is something that's done in the heart. So you have to get your heart right if you're going to be able to worship. So what we should be doing is doing whatever is necessary to get our heart right before we can start appropriate worship of God. It's not a matter of finding a place and sitting in the church on Sunday. It's a special time that we prepare our hearts through meditation and concentration. And that needs to take place before we can come to know God. And that can only happen if we have, through our faith in Christ. Even then, entering the worship can only take place through a deliberate set of meditation, meditation and concentration without thinking about other things. So if you're a saved person, you're a Christian, and you're going into the church, you're going to find a place to sit in a pew or in a chair, whatever your church has, and you're going to worship. You need to get your hearts right. It's not a matter of sitting there, say, on Super Bowl Sunday, wishing you could just hurry up and get out of this place, get home, and get the TV set so you can watch all the Super Bowl activities on TV. It's a matter of sitting there and meditating on God, what he has done for you and how you love him and how he loves you and how you relate to him. That's what worship is about. Then if there's other things you have to do, you still need to set that day apart for God and your worship of him. Okay, but this is about the Sabbath. It's about the Jew. Okay, so the gate is opened on the Sabbath and not closed until the end of the Sabbath at evening time. Then verse 3 of chapter 46 says, if I can find it, on the Sabbath and new moons, the people of the land are to worship in the presence of the Lord at the entrance of that gateway. Verse 4 through 7, here's what the prince does. The burnt offerings the prince brings to the Lord on the Sabbath day is to be 6 male lambs and a ram, all without defect. The grain offering given with the ram is to be an ephah, and the grain offering with the lambs is to be as much as he pleases, along with a hin of olive oil with each ephah. In verse 6, on the day of the new moon, he is to offer a young bull, 6 lambs and a ram, all without defect. Verse 7, he is to provide as a grain offering 1 ephah with the bull, 1 ephah with the ram, 1 and with the lambs, as much as he wants to give, along with the hin of oil for each ephah. This was for Jews. Ezekiel wrote this for the Jews, to the Jews. Yes, we will be involved with this in the Millennial Kingdom, but it was written to the Jews in captivity. It was written for encouragement for them so they could look forward to see the hope of what God is promising for them. And all of this stuff that you're scratching your head saying, why is Kenny reading that? I'm reading it because that's what God's word says, and it was said for Jews about the Millennial Kingdom. All right, verse 9 and 10. 9 through 15 is about general worship regulations. So you're going to have more of this stuff that I just read to you. So let's just go through this fairly quickly. Let me read verse 9 and 10. This is about traffic flow and regulation. 9 and 10 says this: when the temple, well, I didn't read verse 8. Verse 8 said, when the prince enters, he is to go in through the portico of one gate, and he is to come out the same way. So he goes in and out the same place. Starting in verse 9, he says, when the people of the land come before the Lord at the appointed festivals, whoever enters by the north gate of worship is to go out through the south gate, and whoever comes in by the south gate is to go out through the north gate. So however you come in, you go out the opposite way. You just keep on moving through the line, I guess. No one is to return through the gate by which they entered, but each is to go out the opposite way. God is a God of order, not chaos. If you can imagine this many people going in And what it would amount to, they would just be milling around getting in each other's way. So he's getting an orderly flow going here. Verse 10 says the prince is to be among them. So this is one time where the prince will be in the flow with the people. The prince will be among them, going in where they go in and going out where they go out. Okay, remember there are 3 gates, north, south, and east. It's about orderly flow, no changing directions. I don't know if they put a button on your lapel so they know where you came in, so you can't say, I'm going out, I'm going to turn around. It's just orderly flow. It may be honor system, I don't know. Verse 10 says, verse 11 says this, at the feast and the appointed festivals, the grain offering is to be an ephah with a bull, an ephah with a ram, and with the lambs as much as pleases, along with a hin of oil for each ephah. All right. Verse 12 says, when the prince provides a free will offering, right? This is a free will offering. This is over and above the tithe. This is not a limit, not a law specified amount. When the prince provides a free will offering to the Lord, whether a burnt offering or fellowship offerings, the gate facing east is to be open for him. He shall offer his burnt offerings or his fellowship offerings as he does at the Sabbath day. Then he shall go out, and after he has gone out, the gate will be shut. Is this starting to sound enigmatic to you? You know, there's a lot here to digest, and it's a lot that does not, even after you get it under your belt and you understand it, it's just going to be part of daily life. But this was written for the Jews for their encouragement, but we will be involved. Make no mistake about that. All right, verse 13. Verse 13 says this, every day you are to provide a year-old lamb without defect for a burnt offering to the Lord. Morning by morning you shall provide it. That means every morning this sacrifice will be made. That is a departure from what the original law was. It used to say every morning and every evening. So this is cutting that sacrifice in half. I think I'm going to comment on that later. I think I just said that a little earlier. 14 and 15. You are also to provide with it morning by morning a grain offering consisting of 1/6 of an ephah with 1/3 of a hin of oil to moisten the flour. The presenting of this grain offering to the Lord is a lasting ordinance. So the lamb and the grain offering and the oil shall be provided morning by morning for a regular burnt offering. See, we don't think about burnt offerings, and this was a way of life for them. This was the way God specified it for them to live their lives. They came out of Egypt where everything was decided for them, and now they're going to be on their own, and they have to have some kind of governing action made available to keep order among the people. So they had that. This is for later, so they're going to have whatever specified here will be what governs them later. This is a lasting ordinance, a morning by morning sacrifice. Yeah, I think I just told you this. Under the Mosaic Law, it was daily, twice a day, morning and evening. And this is a change to the existing law. This is another thing I've told you before. I want to tell you again right now because I think it's important. There are 2 men in the Bible that were allowed to impart God's law to the people. One was Moses. Who was the other one? The other one was Ezekiel, and he's doing it right here. Those are the only 2. So here he makes a change to the way that daily sacrifices will be performed. That's only going to be during the Millennial Kingdom. But he's not changing the law like we think. They're not going to have a temple to make sacrifices in when they come out of Babylon. or when they come out of the Medes and the Persians, or there's finally going to be one. They get to rebuild their temple under the Medes and the Persians, so they get to do start their sacrifices up again. But it won't be done like this. It's going to be done like it used to be. It's going to be one of those things. Oh, we never did it that way before. They're going to do it like they did before. This is for the future. All right, verse 16 to 18. This is what the sovereign Lord says. If the prince makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his sons, remember the prince is going to get some land. And it says when he, in fact, we talked about that over, I don't remember the verse. It was the early part of chapter 45. But this is what the sovereign Lord says. If the prince makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his sons, it will also belong to his descendants. It is to be their property by inheritance. If, however, he makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his servants, the servants may keep it until the year of freedom. Then it must revert to the prince. His inheritance will belong to the sons only. It is theirs. That's the year of Jubilee. The land reverts to the original owner on the year of Jubilee. So if he makes a gift to his servant, they're still under the law, even though it's a Millennial Kingdom. On that 50th year, he's got to give it back. Okay, verse 18 says, the prince must not take any of the inheritance of the people, driving them off their property. This goes back to what I talked about, the violence and the corruption of the princes in days gone by. This is a way God is seeking to make sure this doesn't happen. That doesn't happen anymore. Here's what he said. The prince must not take any of the inheritance of the people, driving them off of their property. He is to give his sons their inheritance out of his own property. It's my property. I give to my sons. They're my sons. I don't give my sons your property. I give my sons my property. Okay. It's not how it was in the old days. He is to give his sons their inheritance out of his own property, so that not one of my people will be separated from their own property. All right. Verse 19 through 24. This is interesting. Regulations for cooking in the temple. There's several kitchens around. We never did call them kitchens, but that's what they were. It's where cooking is done for the sacrifices. But let's read through here. Verse 19 and 20. Then the man brought me through the entrance of the side of the gate to the sacred rooms facing north, which belonged to the priest, and showed me a place at the western end. He said to me, this is the place where the priests are to cook the guilt offering and the sin offering and bake the grain offering, to avoid bringing them into the outer court and consecrating the people. All right, the most noteworthy thing here that you need to understand, they're cooking the sacrifices, but they're to be kept away from the people. You remember when the priest would do his work in the temple, he wore linen garments, but when he left that area, he had to take those garments off and put on his regular walking clothes before he went out among the people, because by going out with linen clothes on, he would consecrate the people. He would become defiled, and they would become consecrated just by touching those linen garments. Now, we're still talking about the same thing, but it's talking about the food. It's to be kept in this one area so that the people are not consecrated by coming into contact with it. Plus, you probably wouldn't want to eat any of it anyway if they're going to be touching it. I'm just joking. Okay. All right, verses 21 to 24. More talk about kitchens. Let's talk about this. Let's read it. 21 to 24. It will be done. He then brought me to the outer court and led me around to its four corners, and I saw in each corner another court. In the four corners of the outer court were enclosed courts, 40 cubits long. You thought we were through with the cubits, didn't you? 40 cubits long and 30 cubits wide. Each of the courts in the four corners was the same size. Around the inside of each of the four courts was a ledge of stone with places for fire built all around under the ledge. He said to me, "These are the kitchens for those who minister to the Lord or to cook the sacrifices of the people." Okay, I don't have anything to say about that has not already been said, but it's an interesting thing. We spent chapters 40 through 46, so what is that, 7 chapters, talking about the temple, talking about law, talk about observing the law, talking about who does this, who does that, who's going to receive this, who's going to receive that, how do you handle this, how do you handle that, who is going to be having to deal with the consequences of their sin. Remember, the Zadok priests were going to be elevated, not elevated, but they're going to retain the position of special service to the Lord, while the rest of the Levite priests, who were, as the Bible put it, far from the Lord during the times of apostasy. They were disobedient and disrespectful of God. As a result of that, the consequences of their sin would be a demotion in the level of service to God because of their behavior and their disobedience. So it's a lot of words and it's a lot of chapters, but it's there for a purpose, and it's there to tell us those things. And if you're not studying the Bible verse by verse, somebody's going to tell you that in the Millennial Kingdom we're going to revert to the law. You're going to say, unless you studied it verse by verse. We will not be living under grace. Grace was the method of salvation. The way of salvation was provided through God's, well, it's always been through God's grace, but specifically it was through grace after the ascension of Christ and until his second coming. It's the way grace was administered for salvation. We'll be back. There will be under the practice of law in the Millennial Temple, so don't let anybody surprise you with that. You should be ready for that one. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Next week, we're going to be in chapter 47, and it is a very interesting chapter. It's going to be talking about reverting to, you've heard me talk about this and mention it, but this is where it is. We're going to be reverting to Eden-like conditions. It's going to talk about how that happens, when it happens, and what it means, what it's going to look like. I think you'll find it interesting. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for studying with me.